I was around 10 years old at the time, and I remember the night started like any other. My grandma, who lived with us, was making tea in the kitchen while I finished my homework at the dining table. It was a quiet, almost boring routine, the kind of calm kids usually like. My parents had gone out to visit some friends and weren't expected back until late. My grandma was one of those steady, unshakable types, not easily scared or fazed. I, on the other hand, was always curious, maybe too curious, and that curiosity ended up pulling me into something I still can't quite explain. I woke up in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. The house was dark and quiet, but something in the air felt different. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the wind tapping on the hallway window. But there was something else. A faint murmuring sound like a voice coming from the living room. I stayed in bed for a few seconds, thinking it might be the TV or maybe Grandma on the phone, but the pauses between the sounds didn't make sense. My bedroom was at the end of the hallway, so I cautiously opened my door and peeked out. Nothing seemed out of place, just the dim light from the street casting shadows through the windows. I crept toward the entrance to the living room, and that's when I saw her. A woman was standing by the big window, barely moving except for a slight sway back and forth. The streetlight outside lit part of her face, revealing messy hair and a distant, vacant expression. She seemed to be muttering something, but the words didn't make sense, just fragments of sentences that didn't connect. I didn't know what to do. I froze, trying to understand how this person had gotten into our house. The strange thing was, she didn't seem threatening, just lost. That made me more confused than scared, at least at first. Before I could do anything, my grandma appeared in the hallway. She was holding a flashlight, and her expression shifted from surprise to something more serious as soon as she saw the woman. My grandma was small but had a commanding presence, and the way she held the flashlight made me feel a bit safer. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. The woman slowly turned her head, as if coming out of a trance, and responded almost robotically, "They sent me here, but I don't know where they are." Then she began to list names I had never heard before. My grandma took a few steps forward, keeping a safe distance, while I stayed frozen near the hallway door. The woman didn't really seem to notice her. She just kept muttering names and occasionally whispering things like, "They're in the field," or "The light took them." I had no idea what any of it meant, but it was clear she truly believed what she was saying. My grandma, still calm but visibly unsettled, asked again, "Who sent you here? Are you lost?" But the woman didn't answer directly. She just kept repeating those disjointed phrases. There was something eerie about her voice, like she was trying to recall something but couldn't quite grasp it. After a few minutes, my grandma decided to act. "Stay here," she whispered to me before heading to the kitchen. When she came back, she was holding the phone. I felt relieved, thinking she was going to call the police, but to my surprise, she dialed someone else, the psychiatric hospital a few miles from our house. It turns out my grandma had worked there as a nurse before retiring, and she still remembered their number by heart. I didn't know that at the time, but she always said the patients there were just people in pain, not monsters. Maybe that's why she wasn't as scared as I was. Even so, I could tell she was uneasy. While she spoke on the phone, I couldn't take my eyes off the woman. She now seemed to be staring at something beyond the window, but I knew there was nothing out there. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice suddenly clear and firm. A shiver ran down my spine. It felt like she was answering someone only she could see. Then she started listing the names again, but this time with more details. One name, Caroline, seemed tied to a girl in a white dress who, according to the woman, never stopped singing. I didn't know if these were just delusions or twisted memories, but the more she spoke, the more unsettled I became. After hanging up the phone, my grandma approached the woman again and tried to speak to her. "Someone is coming to take you back. You're safe now, okay?" This time, the woman looked directly at her, almost as if seeing my grandma for the first time. She smiled, but it was a crooked, almost childlike smile, and said, "You'll never find them, but I know where they are." It was the strangest thing I'd ever heard. My grandma tried to calm her down, reassuring her that everything would be fine, but before she could say more, we heard the sound of a siren outside. My heart raced. An ambulance had arrived. The ambulance stopped in front of our house, and 2 staff members got out, followed by a man who looked like a doctor or supervisor. They wore white uniforms and carried a clipboard along with a small bag that I guessed contained medical supplies. My grandma greeted them quickly and explained the situation in a calm but low voice, trying not to agitate the woman further. One of the staff members glanced at the woman with a serious expression and signaled for the other to prepare a syringe. I wasn't sure what they were planning to do, but the tension in the air was palpable. The woman, however, didn't seem aware of what was happening around her. She just kept murmuring unintelligibly and staring blankly out the window. As the staff moved closer, the woman began to tremble slightly, as if sensing what was about to happen. "They're calling me," she said suddenly, her voice louder and clearer than before. That made the staff hesitate for a moment, but one of them quickly reached out to grab her arm. What happened next caught everyone off guard. Despite her frail and disoriented appearance, the woman started screaming and struggling with surprising strength, as if she were fighting for her life. "Don't take me back! They need me here!" she shouted, thrashing against their grip. For the first time that night, I felt genuine fear, like something beyond our control was unfolding. My grandma, who had been calm until then, stepped forward and tried to help, speaking to the woman in a firmer tone. "You're safe now. No one is going to hurt you." But it was as if the woman couldn't hear her. She kept resisting, shouting about people who needed her and lights that were coming to take them. Finally, the staff managed to hold her down long enough to administer the injection. Within seconds, her body went limp as the medication took effect. Even then, her eyes stayed open, fixed on some invisible point in the darkness of the hallway. She muttered one last sentence before passing out. "They'll never stop looking." I didn't know what it meant, but the way she said it left a knot in my stomach. The staff carefully placed her on a stretcher and carried her outside while the doctor stayed behind to talk to my grandma. He explained that the woman was a patient who had escaped from the hospital a few hours earlier, and that they had been searching for her since then. He said she suffered from severe delusions and believed she was connected to other dimensions, which explained her incoherent murmurs and the names she mentioned. My grandma seemed relieved that it was over, but I was still trying to process everything. When the ambulance finally drove away, taking the woman with them, the house felt strangely quiet, almost stifling. That night changed the way I saw the world. That night, neither my grandma nor I slept well. While she brewed some coffee in the kitchen, I sat in the living room, staring at the window where the woman had stood for so long. Her image was burned into my mind, especially the way she spoke those names as if they were real people. I tried to forget, but some things wouldn't leave my head. Who were Caroline and the others she mentioned? And what did she mean by, "they'll never stop looking"? Rationally, I told myself it was just her delusions, but something about the way she spoke made me doubt that. In the following days, I tried bringing up the topic with my grandma, but she always brushed it off. "These things happen," she'd say, like it was nothing unusual, but it wasn't normal to me. A few weeks later, she finally told me something she hadn't mentioned that night. When the hospital staff left, the doctor had let slip that the woman had vanished during a group activity, but no one knew how she'd escaped the building, which had reinforced security. Even stranger, she had never been near our neighborhood before. So how did she end up at our house? And why here, of all places? One day, driven by curiosity, I went to the psychiatric hospital with the excuse of picking up my grandma during one of her occasional volunteer shifts. While waiting, I overheard 2 staff members talking about the patient who escaped. They were speaking in hushed tones, but I caught bits and pieces. One of them mentioned that after returning to the hospital, the woman had stopped speaking entirely. She just sat in a corner, staring at the wall. The other said the whole thing was strange because on the night she disappeared, several lights had flickered in the fields near the hospital, and there had been strange humming sounds in the air. That gave me chills, but before I could hear more, my grandma appeared and took me home. Years later, I still think about that night. As an adult, I've tried researching patients escaping psychiatric hospitals and collective delusions, but I've never found anything that explains what happened. The memory of the woman still haunts me, especially her last look before passing out. It felt like she knew something no one else understood. Sometimes, when I'm alone and hear the wind tapping at the window, I find myself looking outside, half expecting to see her there again, murmuring those same names. I don't know what happened to her after that night, but one thing is certain. I've never felt safe in my own home since then. Staying home alone had never been a problem for me. Ever since I was a kid, I enjoyed having the house to myself, blasting music, watching movies, and just savoring the freedom of not having anyone nagging me to do the dishes or fold the laundry. At the time, I was 22 and living with my parents in a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and neighbors who'd known each other for years. That specific night, they had gone out of town to visit some relatives, leaving me behind because I had a college exam on Monday. It was supposed to be just another weekend, but it turned into an experience I'll never forget. It was one of those movie-worthy stormy nights, with lightning cutting across the sky and thunder so loud you could feel it in your chest. The power had gone out a few hours earlier, which wasn't unusual in our neighborhood during heavy storms. I was in the living room with a flashlight, reading a book to pass the time until I got sleepy, when I heard the first sound. It was faint, almost drowned out by the rain, like something moving on the roof. I figured it was the wind. It made sense, right? With all that gusting outside, any branch or debris could make a weird noise. I ignored it and kept reading. But then it happened again. This time it was clearer. Footsteps, heavy ones, right above me. My heart raced, but I forced myself to laugh at my own paranoia. It's probably just some animal, I thought. The house was old, with an attic full of forgotten junk nobody had touched in years. It was the perfect hiding spot for a raccoon or a stray cat, especially on a stormy night. Even so, I couldn't shake the shiver that ran down my spine. It wasn't until the third sound that I got up, my senses now fully on edge. It wasn't coming from the roof anymore. It was inside the house. It sounded like it was coming from the attic, which made no sense because I was sure the only access was from the outside, and no one had touched it in months. It was a dry, rhythmic noise. Knocking. Someone or something was knocking on the attic door. I froze for a few seconds trying to process what was happening. My brain refused to accept the obvious possibility that someone could be in the attic. Maybe it's just the wind pushing against some old wood, I thought, even though I knew it was a weak excuse. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it at the ceiling as if it might reveal something. The knocking continued, spaced out, like whoever, or whatever, was up there was waiting for my reaction before knocking again. My heart was racing, and I could feel cold sweat dripping down my back, despite the chilly air coming from the storm outside. I took a deep breath and decided I couldn't just stand there. I grabbed one of the big kitchen knives, one my mom used for cutting meat, and slowly made my way to the hallway. The door to the attic was in the ceiling at the end of a narrow corridor. Every step I took made the wooden floor creak beneath me, the sound feeling impossibly loud in the silence of the house, broken only by the distant rain and thunder. The flashlight shook in my hand, and I hated myself for being so nervous. "Come on, man up," I told myself, trying to muster some courage. When I got to the attic door, I realized the knocking had stopped. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was up there knew I was now standing below. The eerie feeling of being watched overwhelmed me. The flashlight illuminated the outline of the wooden door, and for a second I was sure I saw a shadow move between the cracks. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but curiosity, or maybe just pure stupidity, kept me rooted to the spot, clutching the knife in my hand. "Who's there?" I shouted, louder than I intended, but my voice shook just as much as the light in my hand. No one answered. That's when I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Not from the attic, but on the wooden stairs leading down from it. Someone was coming down, only I couldn't see anyone. It wasn't like in the movies, where suspense builds with one step at a time. No, these footsteps were fast, urgent, like whoever it was heading straight for me. I screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over the hallway rug and nearly falling. My flashlight hit the floor, spinning, and for a brief moment, it illuminated a face. Only this someone wasn't in the attic anymore. They were right in front of me. I was frozen, staring at the figure for a few seconds before instinctively gripping the knife tighter in my hand. It was a man, but something about the way he looked at me made my stomach twist. His eyes were locked on mine, cold and calculating, like he already knew exactly what he was going to do. He wore a soaked black hoodie, and part of his face was covered by a piece of cloth. What scared me the most was how he stood there, completely still, while I could barely catch my breath. "What do you want?" I managed to stammer, but he didn't respond. Instead, he took a step forward, slow and deliberate, forcing me to back up down the hallway. That's when I realized something even more terrifying. He wasn't alone. As I retreated toward the living room, I saw another man appear from the kitchen, holding a metal rod. My heart sank as the reality hit me. This wasn't an accident or some lost stranger. They were organized, waiting for the right moment to act. Maybe the storm and the blackout were the perfect cover for them. "I don't have anything valuable," I shouted, desperately trying to sound brave. Of course it was a lie. My dad always kept cash and important documents in a small safe in the office, and I had no doubt they knew about it. One of them finally spoke, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost muffled. "We won't hurt you. If you cooperate?" Those words echoed in my mind as I tried to figure out what to do. Cooperating seemed like the only option, but something about the way he said it made me feel like they had no intention of letting me out of this unscathed. With a quick glance, I noticed the front door just a few feet away. If I could distract them long enough, I might have a chance to escape. But the knife in my hand felt useless against two men who were clearly stronger and better prepared than me. That's when a thunderclap exploded outside, so loud it felt like the house shook. I took advantage of their brief distraction, as both men instinctively glanced toward the window, and ran. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just moved. I sprinted through the living room and headed straight for the front door, but when I twisted the handle, it wouldn't budge. Locked. My heart sank, as I remembered I had engaged the deadbolt earlier as a precaution. And now? They were coming after me, their footsteps closing in fast. Finally, my trembling hands managed to unlock the deadbolt, and I threw the door open, feeling the cold rain hit my face like a shock. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran straight into the yard and onto the empty street, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get as far away as possible. Then I heard a scream behind me, but it wasn't a shout of anger or a threat. It was a cry of pain. I dared to glance back for just a second and saw something I couldn't believe. One of the men was sprawled on the porch, clutching his knee as if he'd tripped on something. The other stood frozen in the doorway, hesitating, maybe because of the storm or because he hadn't expected me to run so quickly. Without thinking twice, I kept running down the deserted street until I reached my neighbor's house. Thankfully, Mr. Carl's porch light was on. I banged on the door with all the strength I had, and when he opened it, the look on my face must have said everything. He pulled me inside and locked the door immediately. I explained what had happened between gasps for air, trying to calm down. He didn't ask questions. He just grabbed the phone and called the police while handing me a blanket. Everything felt like a blur, and I could only hear the sound of the rain outside, mixed with the echo of that man's scream. When the police arrived, it took them less than 10 minutes to accompany me back to the house. To my surprise, or maybe relief, the intruders were already gone, taking only a few small items from the living room, as if they didn't have enough time for anything more. The police found muddy footprints and other traces, but no real clues about who they were or where they had come from. To this day, I don't know what they wanted or what would have happened if I hadn't run when I did. I always wonder why that man screamed and whether that was what saved my life. Maybe he got injured, or maybe something else happened in that house that night. I haven't been able to stay home alone without thinking about that feeling of being hunted. And every time I hear footsteps upstairs or something fall, my heart races, even though I know it's just my mind playing tricks on me. The only thing I know is that I'll never again underestimate the sound of footsteps, especially during a stormy night. I was never the type of person to believe in supernatural things, you know? I always thought the world was strange enough without inventing ghosts or wild theories. But what happened that night, I still can't explain it. It was about 2 years ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday. My friend Emily called me in the middle of the afternoon, her voice trembling, saying she'd had a panic attack out of nowhere. She'd never been the anxious type, so it seemed odd. I asked if she wanted some company, and when she hesitated before answering, I knew she did. I grabbed my car keys and headed straight to her apartment without a second thought. When I arrived, she looked a little better, but it was clear something was still off. Emily is the kind of person who worries more about others than herself. So when she started asking how I was doing right after a panic attack, I knew something bigger was going on. The living room was tidy as always, but the apartment had a heavy vibe, you know? Like the air was thicker. She told me the attack started in the morning, out of nowhere, while she was having coffee. She said she felt like someone was watching her. We even laughed about it, joking that it was probably paranoia. But deep down, I knew she wasn't the kind of person to imagine things. As we talked, I started hearing faint noises. You know that kind of sound you only notice because the room is so quiet? It was like scratching or something light moving coming from above. When I mentioned it, she brushed it off, saying the building was old and always made noises like that. But the longer we sat there, the more I heard it. The sound wasn't random. It had a rhythm, like someone trying to be discreet. I started to feel uneasy but didn't want to alarm her. Emily was already on edge, and I didn't want to be the one to make it worse. Eventually, the noise became impossible to ignore. It was a faint, dragging sound, slow but constant. I asked if she could hear it too, and she finally admitted she could. In fact, she said she'd been hearing it for days but thought it was all in her head, or maybe rats in the attic. But the look on her face when she said that told me she didn't believe her own excuse. I told her we needed to check it out. She hesitated, but I insisted. Emily showed me where the attic access was, a small door hidden in the hallway ceiling. I grabbed a chair to reach it, and with my heart racing, I began to open it. The attic door was smaller than I expected, like it was something someone had slapped together rather than properly planned. When I pulled it open, a wave of warm air came down, carrying a strange smell with it. At first I couldn't place it, but now I know it was a mix of dust, mold, and something sour. I climbed up slowly, holding my phone for light. Emily stayed in the hallway, staring up with wide eyes, and I could hear her breathing getting quicker. "If you see anything at all, just come down, okay?" she whispered like she was afraid to speak louder. I just nodded, trying to look more confident than I felt. The attic was cramped, with exposed wooden beams and old boxes piled in the corners. The floor was covered in insulation, that messy, cotton-like stuff. The light from my phone seemed to disappear into the darkness, and the deeper I went, the stronger that smell became. That's when I saw it. In the far corner there was something that looked like an old mattress covered with a filthy blanket. Beside it was a half-empty water bottle and a plate with scraps of food. My heart jumped. Someone had been living there. But the worst part was when I noticed clear tracks in the insulation, footprints leading back and forth to one of the ceiling vents directly above Emily's living room. I froze. It was like my body knew something terrible was happening, but my brain was still catching up. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a sharp creak to my left. A dry, splintering noise, like wood under pressure. My instinct kicked in. I turned off my phone's flashlight and ducked down, barely breathing. I could hear footsteps, not mine. Light, hurried steps moving toward the other end of the attic. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stayed there for what felt like forever, waiting for the silence to return. When it did, I decided I had seen enough. I made my way back to the opening as quickly as I could without making a sound. When I climbed down, my face must have been pale because Emily started crying the second she saw me, even before I said anything. "There's someone up there, Emily," I told her, trying to stay calm. "We need to leave, now." She started asking what I had seen, but all I could focus on was getting her out of the apartment. We grabbed the essentials, phones, wallets, keys, and left as fast as we could. The problem was that, as we were rushing down the stairs, the noise started again, this time from the ceiling above the hallway. And I swear, when I looked up, I saw a pair of eyes gleaming through a crack in the wood. We ran out of the building and straight to my car. Emily was so shaken she could barely fasten her seatbelt. I started the car and just drove, without any clear destination, just as far away from that apartment as possible. On the way, I explained everything I'd seen in the attic, every detail, from the mattress to the footsteps. She started crying again, but this time she didn't say a word. I think she was trying to process it all. After a while, she finally broke the silence. Do you think he was watching me?" I didn't want to answer, but the truth was obvious. Whoever it was had been there for weeks, maybe months, using the attic as a hideout and spying on her life through the air vents. We went straight to the nearest police station. Emily told them everything she'd been experiencing, the panic attack, the noises, the constant feeling of being watched. I filled in the details about what I'd found in the attic, and most disturbingly, the eyes I'd seen in the ceiling. At first, the officers seemed skeptical, but they agreed to send a patrol to investigate. We waited at the station, and every minute felt like an eternity. Finally, one of the officers returned, looking tense. He confirmed they'd found signs of someone living up there: clothes, food, a mattress. But whoever it was had already left. Emily was so scared she refused to go back to the apartment. She stayed at my place that night, and the next day, she started looking for a new place to live. The strangest part came weeks later, when she got a call from the building's management. They told her they'd found a hidden camera in one of the air vents, pointed directly at her living room couch. I've never seen her so terrified. She moved to another city soon after, cut ties with most people, and even deleted her social media accounts. I don't blame her. The thought of someone watching her every move, day and night, is something neither of us has been able to shake. To this day, when I think about that night, I get chills. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't insisted on checking the attic. Maybe we'd never have found out. Maybe something worse could have happened. All I know is that, after this, I became paranoid about every little noise at home. Every time I hear something from the ceiling or the walls, my heart races. I don't know who that man was or what he was planning, but one thing I've learned: that feeling of being watched is never just paranoia. Sometimes it's the only warning you'll get. I've never been a very social person. I was your typical college student, buried in books and binge-watching shows in the little free time I had. Back then, I lived in a tiny but cozy apartment in an old building. It wasn't in the best neighborhood, but it was convenient for someone who relied on public transport and had to save every penny. It was a random Friday night around 11:30 p.m. I had just set aside a tiring project for school and made myself some instant noodles to eat while watching something on my laptop. The city outside seemed calm, with the occasional sound of a car passing by, like a monotonous background tune. That's when I heard the first knock on my door. At first I thought I was imagining things. It was late, and no one ever knocked on my door, especially unannounced. I instinctively looked through the peephole, but the hallway light had been out for days, and all I saw was a blur of shadows. I stepped back, feeling an unexplainable chill run down my spine. The knock came again, a bit more insistent this time. "Who is it?" I called out, trying to sound firm, but my voice came out weaker than I intended. A woman's voice responded, slightly muffled by the door. "Hi, I'm so sorry to bother you, but my car broke down nearby. Can I use your phone?" Her response should have been enough to put me at ease, but something about it felt off. First of all, almost no one asks to use a landline anymore, and I was sure she had to have a cell phone on her. Who doesn't carry a cell phone these days? Second, her tone was strange. She spoke too fast, almost nervously, like she was reciting something she'd memorized. I stood there, my hand on the doorknob, torn between opening the door and telling her to leave. "I don't have a landline," I finally replied after a few seconds, hoping she'd just move on. But she persisted, now sounding almost desperate. "Please, just for a minute, I promise. It's cold out here. I just need to call someone to pick me up." That's when my paranoia really kicked in. I hadn't heard the sound of a broken-down car outside, nor any footsteps in the hallway other than hers. Something about the situation didn't add up, and a disturbing thought began to take shape. What if she wasn't alone? I swallowed hard and took 2 steps back, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm sorry, I can't help you. Try knocking on another door." There was a tense silence on the other side, and for a moment I thought she had left. Then I heard a faint and unsettling sound, like she was whispering something to someone. The idea that she might not be alone froze me in place for a few seconds. Who else could be out there? Was it possible someone else was hiding in the shadows? My breathing grew heavier, and I started noticing things I hadn't before. The sound of movement. No, footsteps. Light and deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera app. It felt a bit ridiculous, but I thought maybe I could record the sound or capture something if I peeked under the door. My hands shook as I turned the volume all the way down and moved back toward the peephole. This time, I saw something that made my heart pound. At the edge of the peephole, where the light from the hallway should have faded into darkness, I caught a glimpse of another shadow moving. It was quick, almost like a blur. It looked like a person, but whoever it was stood so close to the wall that it seemed like they were trying to hide. I backed away again, my heart racing. The woman outside knocked on the door again, harder this time. "Hey, please, can you hear me? I just need some help," she called out, sounding more irritated now. I didn't answer this time. I couldn't. I stood there, frozen, trying to figure out what to do. Then the doorknob turned. At first, it was subtle, a barely noticeable twist, like someone was testing to see if it was unlocked. Then it became more forceful, as though someone was trying to push it open. A shiver ran down my spine, and I backed away even further, nearly tripping over the chair behind me. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice finally breaking free. The sound of the doorknob stopped, but the silence that followed was worse than any noise. It was heavy, oppressive, like the air in the apartment had thickened. I stayed there, listening, until she finally spoke again. "You made a mistake." Her voice was different now, cold and emotionless, as if all the fake urgency had disappeared. I heard footsteps retreating down the hallway, and for a moment, relief washed over me. But at the same time, something inside me whispered that it wasn't over. I immediately called the building's front desk, but there was no answer. It wasn't uncommon for the security guard to take a break at that hour, but in this situation, it made me feel completely exposed. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and moved toward the window, trying to hear anything coming from outside. The problem? My apartment was on the 3rd floor and I couldn't see much beyond the sidewalk below. I stayed there clutching the knife, trying to hear something from outside, but the silence felt even more sinister now. The only sound breaking the void was the low hum of the street lamp, which flickered occasionally. My mind was racing. Had she really left? And what about the whispering I'd heard earlier? Was she talking to someone else? My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Then my phone vibrated. A message alert. I almost dropped it in shock, but I quickly picked it up and saw it was just a notification from my service provider. I sighed, but as I went to put the phone back in my pocket, something on the screen caught my attention. It was a motion detection alert from the building's entrance camera. The building was old, but the property manager had installed cameras a few months ago after a string of break-ins. I opened the feed through the app, my hands sweating so much the phone almost slipped. The video showed the lobby dimly lit by the intercom's weak light. At first I saw what looked like the woman. She was standing there staring at the camera, but there was something wrong with her face. I can't explain it, but it looked empty, expressionless. She was looking straight at the lens, completely still. Then another figure entered the frame. A man, tall, wearing a heavy jacket with the hood pulled up over his head. He walked up behind her and stopped next to her, as if they were waiting for something. They stood there, unmoving, for a few seconds, and then they walked out of view, heading toward the exit. For a brief moment I felt relieved, thinking maybe they had finally left. But the relief didn't last long. A terrible thought crept into my mind. What if they hadn't really left? What if they were just waiting outside? I tried to call the police, but my hands were shaking so much, it took me a few tries to dial the number correctly. When I finally got through, I explained the situation, trying to sound coherent. The dispatcher told me to stay calm, and that a patrol car would be sent, but it might take some time since there was no immediate threat. I thanked her and hung up, trying to steady my breathing. I walked back to the door, pressed my ear against it, and listened. Nothing. The silence on the other side was so complete it made me question whether I had imagined everything. But something deep inside me knew it was real, and that it wasn't over yet. Time seemed to drag as I waited. Every passing second felt like torture, as if the silence around me had taken on a life of its own. I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall opposite the door, still gripping the knife tightly in my hand. My mind was racing with thoughts of everything I could have done differently. Maybe I should have called for help the moment I heard the first knock. Or maybe I was just being paranoid, blowing a bizarre situation out of proportion. But then, something happened that erased all doubt. Footsteps, this time from the floor above. At first, I thought it was my neighbors. The couple on the 4th floor often got home late, but these footsteps didn't sound normal. They were slow, deliberate, like whoever was making them wanted to be heard. My chest tightened, and every fiber of my body went on high alert. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. All I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. I grabbed my phone again and opened the camera app for the building's hallway. I went straight to the feed for my floor. The image was a bit grainy because of the low resolution, but I saw it, someone standing right outside my apartment. It wasn't the woman from earlier, nor the man I'd seen in the lobby footage. It was someone else, a hooded figure wearing a long coat that seemed to glimmer under the dim hallway light. They were standing with their back to the camera, staring at my door. My breathing caught in my throat, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. None of it made sense. How had they gotten there without me hearing? And worse, why were they just standing there completely still, as if waiting for something? When I finally mustered the courage to get up and look through the peephole, there was no one there anymore. It was like the figure had simply vanished. I felt a mix of relief and dread. Something was seriously wrong, and I knew it wasn't just a streak of bad luck. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. 3 knocks. Not at the door this time, but at the window in my living room, the one on the opposite side of the apartment. A window no one could possibly reach on the 3rd floor. I froze. That couldn't be right. My window faced a side street, and below it was just a narrow alley with the building's trash bins. There was no balcony, no fire escape, nothing anyone could use to reach it. But the knocks were real, clear as day. 3 deliberate taps. Slowly, I stepped toward the window, every instinct in my body screaming at me to stop. The curtains were closed, and the thought of pulling them back filled me with dread. What would I see out there? Or worse, who? My entire body was tense, every muscle coiled like a spring, ready to either fight or run. With the knife still in hand, I lifted a corner of the curtain, cautiously. Outside, the street looked empty. The flickering street lamp continued its eerie dance, casting shifting shadows against the walls. There was no one there. I let out a shaky breath, almost laughing at how scared I'd been. But as I turned to let go of the curtain, the knocks came again. 3 sharp, deliberate raps. This time I yanked the curtain open completely, letting the cold night air hit my face as I opened the window. I leaned out, looking down, left, right, even up, half expecting to see someone hanging there. Nothing. Just the chill of the wind and the distant hum of a passing car. I slammed the window shut and locked it with the extra latch I'd installed months ago when break-ins had started happening more frequently in the neighborhood. As I walked back to the living room, my phone buzzed again. It was the police, calling to let me know the patrol car was on its way. That gave me a small sense of relief, but my nerves were still on edge. Then I noticed something strange. The app for the building's cameras was still open, but the feed from my hallway was now nothing but static. That had never happened before. I closed and reopened the app, but it didn't fix the issue. My chest tightened. It felt like someone, or something, wanted to make sure I couldn't see what was happening outside. When the police finally arrived, everything seemed normal. They checked the hallway, the cameras, even the alley behind the building. There was nothing suspicious, nothing out of place. The older officer tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a misunderstanding, maybe some kids pulling pranks. But I knew that wasn't true. The knocks on the window, the hooded figure in the hallway, the woman's strange behavior, it all pointed to something bigger. After the police left, I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, the knife by my side, waiting for the sun to rise. To this day, I still don't know what really happened that night. I never saw that woman or the people with her again. A few weeks later, I heard rumors about a group using similar tactics to break into apartments in nearby neighborhoods. Maybe I was lucky I didn't open the door that night, or maybe it was something darker, something I'll never fully understand. But one thing's for sure. Since that night, I've never looked at a knock on the door the same way again. I've never been the kind of person who believes in strange things. I've always considered myself practical, maybe even a little skeptical. I've lived alone for about 3 years now in a small but cozy apartment. My little haven. I work as an administrative assistant during the day, and at night I like to unwind with a good book or binge-watch TV shows. It was supposed to be a night like any other. A quiet Tuesday, almost midnight, and I was sitting in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, trying to finish a chapter of the book I was reading. That's when I first heard the sound. A faint buzzing noise, almost imperceptible, but just enough to break my concentration. I thought it might be an insect or maybe the neighbor upstairs moving something. I tried to ignore it and keep reading, but the sound was persistent. A low, intermittent buzz that came and went, as if trying to grab my attention. Annoyed, I rolled my eyes, closed the book, and walked around the apartment, trying to locate the source of the noise. I wandered through the living room, then down the hallway, but the sound seemed to fade away. When I reached the kitchen, though, it became clearer. A faint pulsing noise coming from under the table. I stood there for a few seconds, thinking it might be some interference from my router or something, but curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I crouched down to take a closer look, my heart starting to beat a little faster for no apparent reason. At first, I didn't see anything under the table, just the old wood and a few scuff marks I hadn't noticed before. But as I leaned in closer, I saw something strange. There was a strip of duct tape stuck to the underside, holding an object in place. My heart froze. There was a smartphone hidden there. It was taped right in the center, completely out of sight. I carefully peeled it off, my hand trembling slightly. The phone was on, and the screen lit up as soon as I touched it. What I saw made my breath catch. It was a live stream. Of my apartment. Of me. The phone was showing everything I'd been doing up until that moment. Me sitting on the couch, reading my book, walking into the kitchen. My heart raced, and adrenaline surged through me. Who the hell had put this here? How long had it been recording? I glanced around the kitchen, suddenly feeling exposed. I quickly shut the curtains and turned off all the lights. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing. Should I call the police? Should I try to trace the source of the stream? Everything felt surreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare that didn't make any sense. My first instinct was to inspect the phone more closely, but my hands were trembling so much I almost dropped it. The screen clearly showed the kitchen, but you could also see part of the living room in the background. I had just been there, turning off the lights, exactly as I'd done seconds earlier. Whoever was watching had access to my apartment in real time. My heart felt like it was about to explode. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what this meant. Who had put this here? I hadn't had anyone over in weeks, and my apartment was always locked when I left. But what if someone had access somehow? The thought that someone had been in my space, so close to me, without me knowing, sent chills down my spine. Trying to calm my breathing, I realized I had to do something. I unlocked the phone to see if I could find any apps or information that might explain what was going on. The device was password protected. Damn it. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. But something caught my eye. In the corner of the screen, there was a small logo, something that looked like a streaming platform I'd never seen before. The interface was simple, yet professional. I had no idea who might be on the other side, but the thought of it made my skin crawl. I decided to search my apartment. If someone had managed to get in here, maybe they left another clue. I grabbed a knife from the drawer, the only thing I could think of to defend myself, and started checking every corner. I opened cabinets, looked under the bed, and checked behind the doors. Nothing. Everything seemed normal, but that uneasy feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I returned to the kitchen and stared at the phone in my hand. Should I just throw it away? But what if that alerted whoever placed it here? My gut told me the best thing to do was act like I hadn't found it. At least for now. Suddenly, I had an idea. The apartment complex has a single security camera in the hallway, installed by the building management. Maybe it had caught something. I grabbed my own phone, still trembling, and called the building's front desk. I tried to sound calm, but my voice was shaky with every word. I asked the security guard if he could review the footage from the past few days, specifically to see if anyone suspicious had approached my door. He told me he could only do that the next day when the supervisor was in. Frustrated but not surprised, I hung up. It seemed like I was on my own for the night. With the knife still in my hand and adrenaline coursing through my veins, I decided I needed to learn more about the phone. Even though the password blocked full access, I explored what I could. I found a few notifications from an unknown number, but I couldn't open them to read. The only active feature was the live stream. When I tapped the screen, I noticed a small viewer counter in the corner. There were 2 people watching. 2. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Who were these people? Why were they watching me? How much had they already seen? I felt a mix of fear and anger building inside me. I felt violated, like someone had stolen something deeply personal from me, something invisible but profound. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours sitting on my couch, with the living room lights on and the knife by my side. I debated leaving the apartment, but where could I go at that hour? Whoever had done this could be nearby, waiting for me to step outside. Every little noise made me jump. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like a drumbeat. My own breathing felt too loud. That faint buzzing noise from earlier seemed insignificant now, compared to the overwhelming paranoia consuming me. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I would take the phone to the police. The next day, I walked into the police station with the phone wrapped in a plastic bag, like I'd seen in crime shows, trying not to leave my fingerprints on it. I explained everything to an officer who seemed genuinely intrigued, though a bit skeptical. He took the device, said he would pass it along to their tech team, and asked me to recount every detail I could remember. What happened next was almost as unsettling as finding the phone itself. 2 days later, I got a call informing me that the phone had no registered owner, no data usage other than the live stream. It was as if the device had been set up solely for this purpose. No clues, no evidence. Nothing. To this day, I still don't know who did this or why. I changed the locks on my apartment, installed cameras in every corner, and even rearranged some furniture to try and erase the feeling of vulnerability that lingered. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is silent, I think I hear that faint buzzing noise again. And no matter how hard I try to ignore it, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, someone is still watching.